EU antitrust laws may be directed at Microsoft, Amazon, and other cloud service providers in the future. Right now, the EU has a framework called the Digital Markets Act, and it's designed to stop gatekeepers from being able to influence the market's pricing and just and the economic activity that they are enabling. And it's part of their antitrust laws, which would stop large companies from being able to have unnecessary power and too much power over the people that they serve and other competitors. So these are positive things that we would want to encourage, at least from a high level standpoint. You want to encourage antitrust laws, but in terms of implementation, that's sometimes where it gets tricky. It's difficult to determine when someone is operating as a gatekeeper and as some company that's going to have negative impacts on the market. So cloud companies are potentially becoming part of that scope. So it was interesting to me to see it, or to see this story, because when I think of cloud infrastructure, I don't I think that it's important, and it's one of the key resources that every society needs, every nation needs, from businesses to individuals. We're all using the cloud in some way, shape, or form, especially governments. So it was interesting to see that the government is looking at these services as something that we need to keep a closer eye on. But it's different than the traditional services they would seek to, or I'll say in the most recent years. When you see antitrust laws today, or there was a question about whether Google was going to be caught up under those antitrust laws, right? Were they too big at the time with their Google search, and how they're kind of monopolizing the market for advertising and search? That came up as a question. And even that eventually got dropped because I guess there wasn't enough evidence to say that they were a monopoly in their specific industry, their market. But when we think about in the past, the types of companies that were labeled as monopolies, if you think about oil and the Rockefeller Company and how that got broken up, you think about different telecom carriers, AT, and or even think about more recently certain airlines being prevented from actually merging. Those companies all have one thing in common, that they directly serve a customer, and they directly serve individual customers, right? So you're talking about millions of customers at a time. Cloud companies, while they are just as important as airlines, as banks, as you know, telecom carriers, they are not directly serving a customer. They're serving a business who uses their services to serve another customer. So that's almost an expansion of the scope, right? It's no longer just if you directly serve and interact with individuals. If you have any exposure to the market that customers are using, if you're operating at an intersection that can have or can express undue pressure on your customers, on your clients, without them having enough options, enough optionality, and other ways that they could go around you, then you become, according to this potential case, a monopoly and someone that needs antitrust laws implemented against them. It was very interesting from that standpoint, and it goes back to the fact that I've mentioned, that these technology companies, especially cloud service providers, they're becoming, and I'll say becoming, but they are like any other utility today, right? You cannot run your business, you cannot run your country, you cannot do anything without having access to the latest and greatest technology. And the latest and greatest technology is often delivered as a service by a Google, by an Amazon, by Microsoft. And that yes, there are smaller competitors in the space that might provide VMs, or they might provide unstructured source storage, data storage, and even databases, right? If you think about Mongo Atlas, that's their cloud service or their managed service for providing databases. Like all of these services are so important to the way that society works today that without any regulation, it can quickly become, let's say, high pressure for the customers and the users of those services. On the other hand, AWS explicitly is contesting the label as a monopoly, as someone that needs to be regulated under these laws. One, because there are other laws that regulate them, that require them to make it easier for customers to switch, make it easier for them to, or make it more difficult for them to lock customers in with long licensing agreements. But also for the fact that I mentioned that they're not directly interacting with customers and users themselves. But at a certain point, when do we consider the businesses, the clients that use their services, entities that require some protection, right? If you're talking about literally, literally anyone could create a business, but if you have if you have monopoly-like protections on a cloud service provider that all of these businesses need to use, and let's say everyone who is in the nation that wants to start a business, if they all have to go to your company to deliver their service, to actually compete inside of a digital world, then you kind of are a gatekeeper in the space. So it's interesting from that standpoint. Of course, they are fighting it. Who wants to be facing more regulation? Who wants to have higher costs for compliance? But it is interesting to see how we're expanding the definition of a monopoly, how we're expanding the requirements of a business in 2026 and beyond, and even thinking about what services can we just not live without. So something to keep in mind as you're building on any of these cloud providers. If you ever hear the term multi-cloud or cloud agnostic, that's the whole point that we're describing. Most companies want to be able to shift from AWS to Azure to G Cloud or to their own on-premise data centers and workloads, because when you're locked into a specific platform, either through the authentication methods that you use, or from the high cost of data transfer, or even just the networking incompatibility between different providers. That makes you more reliant on one service, right? Imagine when, or think about when AWS had went down for a few hours. There were hundreds of companies throughout the globe that were unable to access their services, unable to serve their customers. That's not the type of situation you want to be in, or for any customer, for anybody, but especially for a company that has their own SLAs to reach with their customers. They have their own delivery and quality that they're trying to hit. Being at the mercy of this company being on time, working all the time, and just keeping up with their requirements is a bottleneck that no one really wants to have that type of third party risk.